They said he was the poorest man in Lekki, but they never understood why even the richest men crossed the road when he walked near. From the moment Tunde stepped onto the bustling street that Monday morning, whispers followed him like shadows. People stared, but no one dared get too close. His shirt was worn thin, his slippers looked tired and broken, but his eyes, those eyes held storms that no one could ever explain. He pushed his wheelbarrow slowly, its rusty, grating squeak echoing between the gleaming luxury cars and the glittering high-rise buildings. Everyone knew him as Tunde the Barrow Boy. To most of the wealthy residents, he was an eyesore, a man who simply didn't belong in Lekki. Yet, he walked with a strange, quiet dignity, a confidence as if he owned something precious that remained unseen to everyone else. Children would often wave at him from their parents' car windows, and he always returned their gesture with a warm, genuine smile. Mothers greeted him with a nod as they passed by, and he would always bow his head slightly in respect. But something shifted when he got too close to power. Security guards would stiffen, their hands inching towards their belts. Wealthy men in sharp suits would deliberately avoid meeting his gaze, their confident strides faltering for just a moment. Rumors swirled around the estate like a dry harmattan wind. Some whispered he was cursed, a man carrying a dark and heavy burden. Others swore he was a prophet, a seer who could look into a man's soul with a single glance. But no one, not a single person, truly knew his story. Tunde never spoke of the past he carried, a past buried so deep it had become a part of his silence. That morning, while he was hauling dirt and rubble from a massive construction site, he stopped dead in his tracks. His body went rigid. His eyes, usually calm and deep, narrowed into sharp, focused points. Something, or someone, had returned. The air grew thick with unspoken tension, and the quiet rhythm of his life was about to be shattered. As Tunde stood there, the dust of his new life settling on his shoulders, a sleek black SUV rolled to a halt right in front of him. It was the kind of vehicle that screamed power, the kind he hadn't seen up close in years. The tinted glass slid down with a silent, menacing hum. Tunde's face, usually weathered and confident, paled. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Tunde was afraid. Inside the SUV, a man sat draped in a navy blue agbada, the rich fabric a stark contrast to the dusty construction site. His fingers, resting on the leather-clad door, were heavy with gold rings that glinted in the afternoon sun. He looked like a king holding court. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost too calm, a placid lake hiding a monstrous depth. "Tunde, it's time." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a past Tunde had fought so hard to escape. A strange stillness fell over the entire site. Workers, who had been shouting and hammering just moments before, froze in place, their tools held mid-swing. It was as if the world itself had stopped. Even the constant sea breeze, which always whispered through the half-finished buildings, seemed to hold its breath, waiting. All eyes were on the man in the car and Tunde, two figures from different worlds colliding in this ordinary place. The air grew thick with unspoken history and imminent danger. Tunde swallowed hard, the sound loud in the unnatural silence. He tried to steady his voice, to reclaim the man he had become. "I told you," he started, his voice a rough whisper. "I'm done with that life." He had built this new existence with his own two hands, brick by brick, and he wouldn't let it be torn down. The man in the car just smiled, a slow, chilling curve of the lips that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. It was a smile that held no warmth, only a promise of inevitability. "You don't get to walk away from destiny," the man whispered, his voice a low, hypnotic hiss that seemed to snake its way into Tunde's very soul. And with those few words, the world Tunde had so carefully constructed shattered into a million pieces. The ordinary sun, the dusty ground, the smell of cement and sea salt, it all faded away. The ghosts of his past were no longer just memories. They were here, sitting in a black SUV, ready to drag him back into the darkness. His new life was over. The old one had just come to collect its debt. The SUV's taillights vanished into the hazy afternoon, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the faint scent of expensive cologne. Tunde sagged against the rough concrete of the unfinished building, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He pressed his fingers against his right wrist, the old scar there throbbing with a phantom heat, as if the wound had just been made. It burned, a stark white line against his dark skin, a brand of a life he thought he had escaped. For a decade, he had managed to keep this part of himself hidden in plain sight. No one ever asked about the scar. His coworkers, his neighbors, they all saw it and simply assumed it was a relic from some construction accident or a mishap from his days as a laborer. An honest injury for an honest man. The truth was anything but honest. It was a dark, twisted thing, rooted in a time and place he had fought tooth and nail to forget. Staring at the jagged line on his wrist was like opening a floodgate. The memories, long suppressed, rushed in with the force of a tidal wave. He wasn't here, behind this dusty construction site. He was back in a dimly lit shrine, the air thick with the cloying smell of incense, and something coppery, something metallic. Chanting voices surrounded him, a low, guttural hum that vibrated through the very floorboards and into his bones. He could feel the cold, sharp edge of the knife against his skin, hear the solemn words of the oath being spoken over him. A promise. He had sealed that vow with his own blood, a foolish, desperate boy playing with forces far beyond his understanding. He had been only 19 then. A child, really. Scared, naive, and so desperate to save someone he loved that he would have bartered his own soul. He didn't understand the true cost of what he was doing. He didn't know that promises made in the grip of fear don't just bind you. They become chains. Heavy, cold chains of iron that wrap around your spirit and drag you back into the darkness, no matter how far you run. He had thought that running far enough, for long enough, would eventually break them. For 10 years, he almost believed it. He had built a new life, a simple life, brick by painstaking brick. He had a job, a small apartment, a routine. He was Tun the mechanic, Tun the quiet neighbor. The man in that gleaming black SUV, Chief Balagan, was proof of that. Balagan didn't just want a favor, he wanted him back. Back to the brotherhood. Back to the shadowy world of oaths and obligations. Back to that terrible night he had fled, leaving everything and everyone behind. The chief's voice, smooth as silk but with an undercurrent of steel, still echoed in his ears. You can't run from who you are, Tund. You belong to us. He had thought he was free, but the scar on his wrist was a permanent reminder, a leash. And now, the man holding that leash had finally come to pull him back. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the images wouldn't stop. The shrine, the knife, the blood, and the face of the person he had tried to save. The very reason he had made the deal in the first place. The past wasn't just catching up to him. It was here to swallow him whole. Tund closed his eyes, a single drop of sweat tracing a cold path down his neck. He felt the familiar chill, the icy grip of a memory that refused to die. Not again, he whispered, a desperate plea to the unseen forces that seemed to delight in his torment. The world around him, the bustling Lagos street, faded into a dull roar. All that existed was the heavy beat of his own heart, a drum signaling a coming storm. He was a man trapped, not by walls or bars, but by a secret he'd sworn to carry to his grave. But the past, he was learning, had a way of clawing itself out of any tomb. Footsteps crunched on the gravel nearby, pulling him back to the present. It was Mama Ronk, the neighborhood's beloved food vendor, her face a roadmap of kindness and concern. She wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron, her brow furrowed. Tund, she said, her voice warm but laced with worry. You're shaking. He tried to assemble his features into a reassuring smile, but it felt like a fragile mask. Nothing, Mama. He hoped the casual dismissal would be enough, but Mama Ronk had seen too much of life to be so easily fooled. She looked deep into his eyes, as if searching for the source of the tremor in his hands. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her touch surprisingly firm. Your spirit is troubled, she said softly, her voice dropping to a near whisper, meant only for him. Whatever it is, remember this, my son. Secrets grow heavier when you carry them alone. A shared burden is a halved burden. Her words were simple, an old proverb he'd heard 100 times, but today they landed like daggers, piercing the armor he had so carefully constructed around his heart. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to confess, to pour out the poison that was corrupting him from the inside. But how? How could he explain a secret so monstrous it could shatter the life of anyone who heard it? The knowledge was a curse, and sharing it would only spread the contagion. He was its keeper and its prisoner. He simply nodded, unable to form a reply. Mama Ronk gave his shoulder a final, compassionate squeeze before turning back to her stall, leaving Tund alone with his spiraling thoughts. As she walked away, the sun, a fiery orb of molten gold, dipped below the horizon of the Lagos Lagoon. The sky bled into hues of orange and purple, a beautiful, violent spectacle. But Tun saw no beauty in it. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an unspoken omen he could feel deep in his bones, a primal dread that whispered of an impending reckoning. The past wasn't just a memory anymore. It was here, a tangible presence breathing down his neck, and it had finally come to collect its debt. Time had run out. He knew he couldn't run from it any longer. The ghost he had tried to outpace had finally caught up. As darkness enveloped the city, Tund understood with chilling certainty that this night would be different. This night, the silence would be broken, and the secret he had guarded so fiercely would finally demand its price. The story was far from over. In fact, the most terrifying chapter was just about to begin. That night, Tund lay on the thin mat in his cramped, one-room apartment. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford, his mind a battlefield of memories and regrets. Moonlight, cold and pale, streamed through the single cracked window, a silver spotlight on the photograph he kept carefully hidden under his pillow. He pulled it out, the worn edges a testament to how many times his fingers had traced the image. Her name was Adora. Even whispering it in the silence of his room felt like a sacred act. The name tasted of sunshine and forgotten promises. 10 years had passed, a decade of struggle and solitude, but she remained his first love, his only love. She was the girl with eyes like the first light of morning and a laugh so pure it could soften even the hardest of days in their bustling, unforgiving neighborhood. He closed his eyes, and just like that, he was transported back in time. They had grown up together on the same dusty street in Ajagunal, a part of Lagos that demanded resilience. Their dreams were their only escape, vast and colorful, stretching far beyond the rusted corrugated iron roofs that defined their world. Tund, ever practical, planned to start a small mechanic shop. He was good with his hands, able to coax life back into sputtering engines. Adora, with her gentle spirit and caring heart, wanted to be a nurse. She wanted to heal, to mend, to offer comfort where there was pain. They were two halves of a whole, inseparable, their futures woven together in a tapestry of shared hopes. They would build a life, a better one, side by side. But destiny, as Tund had learned so painfully, rarely listens to the plans of young lovers. It has its own cruel and unpredictable script. Their shared dream came to a screeching halt on one particularly brutal rainy night. The kind of rain that washes away everything. Adora, who was always so full of life, fell gravely ill. A fever raged through her body, and she became weaker with every passing hour. Panic set in. Tund and her family rushed her to the nearest hospital, their hearts pounding in rhythm with the relentless downpour. But the hospital doors were as cold as the diagnosis. They demanded money up front, a sum so large it felt like a mountain they could never hope to climb. They didn't have it. No one they knew had that kind of money. They were trapped, watching the light in Adeora's eyes begin to dim, helpless against a system that valued currency over a human life. That night, the rain didn't just fall on the streets of Ajagunal. It fell on Tund's entire world, washing away the future he had so carefully built with the girl he loved. In a desperate bid to save his wife, Adora, Tund found himself at the doorstep of Chief Balagan, a man whose power was as immense as it was shadowy. People whispered about the favors he granted, favors that came at a steep, unspoken price. The chief listened to Tund's plea, his eyes unreadable, and agreed to provide the money for Adeora's life-saving surgery. But it wasn't alone. It was a pact, a vow sealed in blood, binding Tund to a secret society, the Brotherhood. The surgery was a success. Adora survived, her laughter returning to fill their small home. She was alive, but she was oblivious to the dark bargain that had secured her future. Tund carried the heavy secret, waiting for the right moment to confess. Before he could find the words, the Brotherhood summoned him. Their favor had been granted. Now it was time for Tund to repay his debt. Their demands were not something he could ever fulfill without losing himself completely. He knew what they were capable of. The Brotherhood didn't just collect on debts. They obliterated the debtor's entire world. They would target what he loved most, and what he loved most was Adora. To protect her was to abandon her. He vanished into the night, leaving Adora with nothing but silence and a hole in her heart. He didn't leave to hurt her. He left to save her from a darkness she couldn't possibly comprehend. Every step he took away from her was an act of love, a shield against the evil he had invited into their lives. Years passed. Tunde lived a life in the shadows, constantly looking over his shoulder. He kept a single, worn photograph of Adora, her smile a painful reminder of everything he had lost. He liked to imagine she had moved on, found happiness somewhere far away, safe from his world. He would often clutch the photo, his voice a barely audible whisper against the worn paper. "Forgive me, my love." One quiet evening, as he sat in his small, anonymous room, the sudden roar of a motorcycle engine shattered the silence. It wasn't just a passing vehicle. There was an aggression to the sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Tunde sat bolt upright, his hand instinctively going to the photo in his pocket. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, washed over him. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. A single thought consumed him, a terrifying premonition that chilled him to the bone. Adora. Was she in danger again? Had his past finally caught up to them both? The hunt wasn't over. It was just beginning. 3 sharp knocks thundered through Tunde's apartment, so loud they seemed to shake the very walls. Midnight. In Lekki, the dead of night was a sacred, silent time. Visitors did not come knocking at this hour. An unsettling feeling crept up his spine, cold and sharp. He moved with a practiced silence, his feet barely whispering against the cool tile floor. His hand found the familiar weight of the small wooden stool he kept by the door. It wasn't much of a weapon, but in a pinch, it was better than nothing. He pressed his ear against the door, straining to hear any sound from the other side. Silence. He held his breath. "Who is there?" The words hung in the air, swallowed by the oppressive quiet. For a moment, he thought he might have imagined it. Then, another knock came, but this time it was softer, almost hesitant, like a plea rather than a demand. The change in tone was even more unnerving. His hand, slick with sweat, turned the lock. He pulled the door open just a crack, a sliver of space to peer through. The corridor outside was bathed in the dim, yellow glow of a single security light, casting long, distorted shadows. A figure stood there, shrouded in a dark, hooded shawl, trembling. It was impossible to make out a face, only a silhouette shaking in the gloom. "Tunde." The voice was a fragile whisper, thin and broken, yet it carried a familiarity that sliced through the years, through all the walls he had built around his heart. The sound of his name, spoken with such desperate vulnerability, hit him like a physical blow. The wooden stool slipped from his grasp, clattering loudly on the floor. He forgot all about the danger, all about the late hour. "Adora," he breathed, disbelief and a flood of forgotten emotions choking him. Before he could say another word, or even fully process her presence, she stumbled past him, collapsing into his room as if her legs could no longer support her. He quickly shut the door behind her, his heart hammering against his ribs. She pushed back her hood, and the dim light from his bedside lamp fell upon her face. It was her, but not the her he remembered. Her once long, flowing hair was cut short, framing a face that was gaunt and thin. Her clothes were worn and ragged. Yet, as her gaze met his, he saw them, the same eyes. Those deep, expressive eyes that held entire galaxies of emotion. The eyes he could never, ever forget. He stood frozen, a statue carved from shock and a dozen unanswered questions. She reached out, her hands clutching the front of his shirt, her knuckles white. She gasped for air, her words coming out in ragged, desperate pants. The words hung between them, a death sentence delivered in a whisper. Tunde's knees felt weak, threatening to buckle. He managed to ask, his voice barely audible. "How did they find you?" Her face crumpled, and tears, hot and silent, began streaming down her cheeks, carving paths through the grime on her skin. She shook her head, a sob catching in her throat. "You can't protect me from a promise you made, Tunde." A promise. At that exact moment, a jagged bolt of lightning tore across the night sky, illuminating the entire room in a brilliant, blinding flash of white. And in that stark, unforgiving light, the final, terrifying piece of the puzzle slammed into place. The truth hit him with the force of a physical impact. Chief Balagan had never intended to let either of them go. Their fate had been sealed from the very beginning. The last sliver of daylight vanished as Tunde yanked the heavy curtains shut, plunging the small room into near darkness. He spun around, his voice a harsh whisper. Adora, what are you doing here? Who brought you? How did you even escape? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stumbled forward and collapsed onto the thin mat in the corner, her chest heaving with ragged breaths. Her eyes were wide with a terror that chilled him to the bone. They came to the clinic, she finally gasped out, the words tumbling over each other. The clinic where I work. They were asking questions, Tunde, questions about you. A knot of ice formed in his stomach. He sank to his knees beside her, the truth hitting him like a physical blow. So you became a target, he murmured, the words tasting like ash. Because of me. Adora furiously wiped at the tears streaming down her face, her hands shaking. Tunde, they said your time is up. They said the Brotherhood wants something you took from them. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing. He searched his memory, a frantic, desperate scan of his past, but came up empty. I didn't take anything, he insisted, his voice raw. I swear, Ada, I took nothing. Then why? She cried, her voice cracking under the strain. Why are they hunting you like an animal? What did you do? Before a single word could form on his lips, a deafening bang erupted from the entrance of the dilapidated building. It wasn't a gunshot, but something heavy hitting the main door, followed by the unmistakable sound of splintering wood. Rough, angry voices echoed up the stairwell, accompanied by the thud of heavy footsteps, getting closer with each passing second. Tunde's blood ran cold. He didn't need to see them to know who it was. They're here, he breathed, the two words sealing their fate. Adora's hand shot out and clamped onto his arm, her nails digging into his skin like tiny claws. Tunde, what do we do? What do we do? Her voice was a high-pitched plea, bordering on a scream. His eyes darted around the tiny, claustrophobic room. A threadbare mat, a rickety table, a single wooden chair. No weapons. No hidden passages. The one window overlooked a 3-story drop onto concrete. There was no escape. There was no place to hide. There was only one impossible choice left. He met her terrified gaze, his own fear momentarily eclipsed by a surge of desperate resolve. We run. And just like that, with the sounds of their hunters growing louder just outside the door, the chase began. The city lights of Lekki blurred into streaks of color as they burst onto the dark streets. But this wasn't a night for enjoying the view. Behind them, the screech of motorbikes cut through the air, a sound Tunde knew all too well. He grabbed Adora's hand, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He pulled her into the labyrinth of narrow alleys, a maze he had navigated for a decade. These were his shadows, his sanctuary. He knew every turn, every dead end, every escape route. The smell of street food and exhaust fumes filled their lungs as they ran, their footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. Suddenly, a deafening crack shattered the night. A bullet tore through the rear window of a parked car just inches ahead of them. Glass exploded outwards. Adora screamed, a raw, terrified sound that pierced Tunde's soul. Without a second thought, he threw an arm over her head, shielding her as he pushed her forward. The motorbike engines were getting closer, a relentless growl hunting them down. He could almost feel the heat of their headlights on his back. Panic was a cold knot in his stomach, but he couldn't let it win. Not now. Not with Adora. They stumbled out of the alley and onto a busy, chaotic junction. Cars, buses, and kikis fought for space, a river of noise and light. It was their only chance. Tunde raised his arm, waving desperately, his voice lost in the cacophony. A kiki, a small 3-wheeled taxi, slowed down, its driver eyeing them with suspicion. Please help us. Adora cried out, her face pale with terror, her voice trembling. The driver saw the genuine fear in their eyes, the desperation that clung to them like a shroud. He jerked his head. Enter quick. They scrambled into the back of the kiki, collapsing onto the worn seat. The little engine roared to life, and they lurched forward, weaving recklessly through the traffic. Tunde dared to look back. The Brotherhood's men were swarming the street they had just left. Dark figures on powerful bikes, their faces obscured, fanning out, their search methodical and menacing. They were like wolves scenting prey. The kiki put some distance between them, but the image of the hunters was burned into Tunde's mind. They wouldn't give up easily. He knew that from bitter experience. The chase was only just beginning. Adora leaned against him, her body trembling uncontrollably. He wrapped his arms around her, trying to offer a comfort he didn't feel himself. The adrenaline was still pumping, but a deep, familiar ache was settling in his bones. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his, filled with a million questions he had always dreaded. Tund, how long? How long have you been running like this? He swallowed the lump in his throat. The truth felt heavy, like a stone. 10 years, he admitted, the words tasting like ash. She closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. The weight of his secret, his hidden life, finally crashed down upon her. You should have told me, she murmured, her voice a mix of hurt and exhaustion. He held her tighter, resting his cheek against her hair. I loved you too much to put you in danger, he whispered back, the confession raw and painful. It was the truest thing he had ever said. He yelled, his eyes wide in the rearview mirror. Tund's head snapped up. 2 motorbikes were gaining on them, weaving through traffic with terrifying skill. The screech of tires, the blare of horns, the chaotic symphony of Lagos traffic. It all faded into a dull roar the moment our feet hit the pavement. We didn't just get out of the Kiki, we fled, melting into the bustling crowd of Oberland like ghosts. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat a frantic drum signaling our narrow escape. I risked a glance back, but the faces in the sea of people were a blur. We ran, weaving through market stalls and past street vendors, until the scent of dust and decay replaced the city's vibrant perfume. We ducked into the shadows of an abandoned warehouse, the silence inside a deafening contrast to the world we'd just left behind. The air was thick and heavy, tasting of rust and forgotten things. For a long moment, the only sound was our ragged breathing. Finally, I broke the silence, my voice raspy. They want something I have, something I didn't even know was valuable. Adora leaned against a crumbling brick wall, her chest still heaving. She pushed a stray braid from her face, her eyes sharp and questioning in the dim light filtering through a grimy window. What is it, Tund? Her frown deepened, etching lines of worry onto her forehead. My hand trembled as I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket. My fingers closed around the familiar, worn texture of a tiny leather pouch. I pulled it out, holding it in my palm. It was small, unassuming, something you wouldn't look at twice. Adora stared at it, her expression shifting from worry to pure confusion. That? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What is that? This was given to me by Chief Balagan, I explained, my voice low. The night I made the vow. Adora stepped closer, her gaze fixed on the small pouch in my hand. The air between us crackled with unspoken tension. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the fear battling with her insatiable curiosity. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, she spoke, her voice firm. Open it now. Her words weren't a suggestion, they were a command. My fingers, slick with sweat, fumbled with the thin leather string. It felt as if I was unwrapping not just a physical object, but my own destiny. Slowly, carefully, I loosened the knot and tipped the contents into my hand. It wasn't gold or a key, a small wooden carving. Dark, aged wood, intricately carved with a symbol I didn't recognize. It felt ancient, radiating a strange warmth against my skin. It looked like a stylized bird of prey intertwined with a serpent. It was beautiful, but utterly meaningless to me. I looked at Adora, expecting confusion, but what I saw was something else entirely. She reached out, her fingers hovering just above it, not daring to touch. Tund, she whispered, her voice filled with a reverence that sent a chill through me. This is an ancient family seal. It belongs to the Balagan lineage. A cold dread began to creep into my veins, a stark contrast to the warmth of the carving. No, that's impossible. Why would he give it to me? It's his family's legacy, not mine. I looked from the seal to her face, searching for an answer, for anything that would make this nightmare logical. But the look on her face wasn't one of confusion. It was one of dawning, gut-wrenching horror. She stared at me, really stared at me, as if seeing me for the first time. Tund, she said, her voice trembling with the weight of her realization. Its possession signifies more than just ownership. This seal means you're the rightful heir to lead the Brotherhood. Tund's hands trembled, the heavy, ornate seal clattering to the dusty floor. He stumbled backward, his voice a choked whisper. He looked at Adora, his eyes wide with disbelief. searching for any sign that this was just a cruel joke. Adaora's gaze was steady, filled with a deep, ancient sorrow. She nodded slowly, her expression unwavering. Tund, you're not just anyone. You have to understand. Your father, before he died, he wasn't just a simple man. He was a respected guardian, a keeper of the sacred traditions. Tund shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. My father? My father was a fisherman. I spent my childhood mending his nets and smelling of the sea. That's who he was. The memories were so clear, so real. How could they be wrong? That's what you were told, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the howling wind outside. It was a story created to protect you. But Balagan knew the truth. He knew who your father was, and he feared your bloodline more than anything in this world. The room started to spin. Tund felt dizzy, like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. He leaned against a stack of crates, his mind racing to connect the pieces. So, the vow he made me swear, it was all a trick? The ceremony, the sacred words, the weight of the chief's hand on his shoulder, was it all a performance? He wanted control, Adora confirmed, her voice laced with quiet fury. He knew he couldn't force you to join him, not with your heritage. So he manipulated you, bound you with a false oath. If you had refused to join him willingly, he would have had no choice but to destroy you. A wave of nausea washed over Tund. He began to pace the length of the warehouse, his boots kicking up dust with every frantic step. He gripped his head, his fingers digging into his hair. Everything in my life was a lie. His childhood, his purpose, his very identity. All of it felt like a fragile storybook, its pages now torn to shreds. Was anything real? Adora gently reached out, her warm hand closing over his. The contact was grounding, a small anchor in the storm raging inside him. Not everything, she said softly. The strength you've built, the courage you've shown, that's all yours. You still have choices, Tund. The path forward is yours to forge. As if on cue, a deafening clap of thunder rumbled outside, shaking the warehouse to its foundations. The corrugated metal walls rattled, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Tund's frantic pacing stopped. He turned, his eyes locking onto the seal lying on the floor. It glinted in the dim light, a symbol of a destiny he never knew he had. A new thought, sharp and clear, cut through the confusion. A flicker of defiance ignited in his chest. If Balagan fears me, then he fears what I can become. He bent down, his hand closing around the cool, solid weight of the seal. The choice was his, and for the first time, he felt the stirrings of a power he was only just beginning to understand. The first hint of dawn was just beginning to break, painting the grimy warehouse windows in shades of gray and pale rose, but inside, sleep was a distant memory. Tund and Adora had spent the entire night in a state of tense wakefulness, the silence thick with unspoken fears. The ancient seal, the object of all this chaos, sat heavy between them, a silent testament to the danger they were in. Every rustle, every distant siren, had them jumping, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. They had replayed every possible scenario in their minds, each one more grim than the last. How could they possibly escape a man with eyes and ears all over the city? Just as the first true rays of sunlight pierced the gloom, a sudden, jarring sound shattered the quiet. A phone rang, its shrill tone echoing off the concrete walls. Adaora's hand shot out, grabbing the device as if it were a venomous snake. The screen glowed ominously, displaying only 2 words, unknown number. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at Tund, her eyes wide with terror. Tund's voice was a low, urgent whisper, barely disturbing the air. Answer it. His expression was grim, his jaw set. There was no running from this. They had to face it, whatever it was. With a trembling finger, Adora accepted the call and immediately pressed the speaker button. A deep, resonant voice, cold and familiar, filled the vast space of the warehouse, seeming to seep into the very walls around them. It was Chief Balagan. Tund. The voice boomed, devoid of any warmth. I trust you've had a moment to consider your position. Bring the seal to the old temple on the outskirts of the city tonight. Come at midnight. There was a pause, a moment of pure, chilling silence before he delivered his final, devastating blow. Or Adaora's family will pay the price for your defiance. A sharp gasp escaped Adaora's lips, a sound of pure horror. All the blood drained from her face. "My family," she cried out, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. "They have nothing to do with this. Leave my family out of this." Her voice echoed, a desperate plea in the cavernous room. From the other end of the line, Balagan's response was not anger, but a soft, condescending laugh. It was a sound that made the hairs on their arms stand up, a chilling sound of absolute power and amusement. "Oh, my dear Adora," he purred. "You wanted to understand the world of power. Well, here is your first lesson. Leadership, it always requires sacrifice. Others must bear the weight of your choices." Tun's hands clenched into tight fists at his sides, his knuckles turning white. A raw, protective anger surged through him, hot and blinding. He stared at the phone as if he could will his fury through the line. "Balagan," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "This is between you and me. If you want me, come for me. Don't you dare bring them into this." But Balagan was unmoved by the threat. His tone remained flat and final. "You have until midnight," he stated simply, ignoring Tun's outburst. "The old temple. And Tund, come alone." Before either of them could utter another word, the line went dead. An abrupt click, followed by an oppressive, suffocating silence that was far worse than the call itself. The finality of it was absolute. Adora began to tremble uncontrollably, her body shaking as she stared at Tund, her eyes filled with a terrifying premonition. "Tund, he's not going to negotiate. It's a trap. He'll kill you." But Tund was no longer looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the ancient seal resting on the crate. A strange calm seemed to settle over him, replacing the fiery anger with a steely resolve. He reached out and picked up the seal, its weight familiar in his palm. He looked at Adora, his eyes clear and determined. "He won't kill me," Tund said, his voice steady now. "Not if I face him with the truth. This ends tonight, one way or another." He held the seal up, its intricate carvings glinting in the faint morning light. It wasn't just an artifact anymore. It was his only weapon, the key to exposing Balagan for the monster he truly was. The ultimatum had been given. The choice had been made. Now, all that was left was the final confrontation. Deep in the forest's outside Ape, a place whispered about in fear and long forgotten by most, stood an old temple. As dusk painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, two figures, Tund and Adora, made their way through the dense trees. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of burning torches and the rhythmic, heart-pounding echo of distant drums. It was a sound that seemed to pull them forward, a siren's call to a destiny they couldn't escape. They broke through the last line of trees and saw it. A clearing, bathed in the flickering orange glow of firelight. Hooded figures formed a silent, ominous circle, their voices rising and falling in a low, guttural chant, reciting words from an age long past. The very ground seemed to vibrate with the power of their incantations. Tun's hand instinctively tightened on the object hidden beneath his cloak. Adaora's breath hitched, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. This was the place from the stories, the source of the shadows that had haunted Tun's family for generations. From the deepest shadows of the temple's entrance, a man emerged. His movements were fluid, like a predator stalking its prey. It was Balagan. His voice, when he spoke, was a low growl that slithered through the air. "You came." It wasn't a question, it was a statement of triumph. Tund felt a surge of defiance. He met Balagan's gaze without flinching, his own eyes burning with a resolve that had been forged in years of searching for this very moment. With a steady hand, he pulled the ancient seal from his cloak. It was a heavy, ornate artifact, humming with a faint, internal light. The sigils carved into its surface seemed to dance in the torchlight. He held it up for all to see. "This belongs to my family." Tund's voice rang out, clear and strong, cutting through the chanting. "Not yours." A collective gasp swept through the circle of hooded figures. The chanting faltered, the rhythm of the drums stuttering for a moment. All eyes were now fixed on the seal, then on Tund, then on Balagan. The challenge had been made. Balagan's cold smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pure fury. His eyes, which had been dark before, now seemed to swallow the light around them, becoming two pools of infinite shadow. The air crackled with sudden, violent tension. "Give it to me," he snarled, the words tearing from his throat. It was a command, backed by an unspoken promise of immense pain. He took a step forward, his hand outstretched, fingers curled like talons. He believed the artifact was his by right, by power, and this boy was a fool to stand in his way. But Tund didn't retreat. He held the seal tighter, its warmth a comforting presence against his palm. "No," he said, his voice unwavering. "This is about the lies, the secrets, the darkness you've spread. The truth ends tonight." He was no longer just a boy reclaiming his birthright. He was a warrior ready to expose a long-hidden evil. Balagan's face contorted in a final snarl of rage. He had no more words. With a sharp, almost imperceptible flick of his wrist, he gave the signal. The circle of hooded figures broke. Like shadows given life, his men surged forward, their intent clear and brutal. They moved as one, a silent, deadly wave, surrounding Tund and cutting him off from Adora. They were closing in, their hands reaching, their faces hidden in the darkness of their hoods. Adaora's voice ripped through the night, a raw scream of terror and desperation. "Tund." She watched in horror as they grabbed him, their grips like iron vices. They began to drag him, fighting and struggling, toward the great stone altar at the center of the clearing, the place of sacrifice. "Tund, fight," she cried out, her voice breaking, helpless as the man she loved was pulled toward his doom. Balagan lifted his gnarled staff high into the air, the strange symbols carved into the wood seeming to pulse with a dark energy. His voice, a low and menacing chant, echoed across the tense clearing. The words were ancient, forgotten by most, and as he spoke, the sky above began to churn. The clear blue was consumed by a swirling vortex of angry, dark clouds. Lightning flickered within them, a silent promise of the storm he was summoning. He was a master of dark arts, and everyone present knew the destructive power he was about to unleash. This was the end. He was going to wipe out any last vestiges of opposition. Below him, in the center of the circle of armed men, Tund knelt on the hard-packed earth. His knuckles were white as he gripped the small, circular object in his hand, the ancient seal of his ancestors. It felt cool against his skin, almost lifeless. Despair gnawed at him. He had brought it here, believing it held some key, some hope, but it was just a piece of carved stone. The wind whipped his hair across his face, and he could hear the rising panic in the crowd of villagers huddled at the edge of the clearing. He closed his eyes, his mind racing. Was this how it all ended? With him kneeling at the feet of his father's murderer? He thought of his mother, of Adora, of the faces of his people, filled with a desperate, fading hope. He poured all his fear, his grief, and his desperate yearning for justice into the seal. He focused on the memory of his father, a man he barely knew but whose legacy he carried. A faint warmth, like the first ray of dawn, began to emanate from the seal. It was barely perceptible, but it was there. And then it happened. A sudden, explosive gust of wind erupted from him, a physical manifestation of his inner turmoil. It wasn't the storm wind Balagan was calling. This was different. It was a pure, cleansing force that slammed into the men surrounding him, pushing them back, making them stumble and fall. The controlled chaos of Balagan's ritual was shattered in an instant. The chanting stopped abruptly. Balagan stared, his eyes wide with disbelief, at the boy who was now the epicenter of this impossible whirlwind. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. This cannot be," a warrior whispered, his voice trembling not with fear of Balagan, but with awe. The power radiating from Tund was unlike anything they had ever witnessed. It felt ancient, rightful. Adora, standing near the edge of the chaos, covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and wonder. "Tund, what's happening?" she breathed, the question lost in the howling wind. She had always known he was special, but this was beyond comprehension. Tund didn't hear her. He was lost in the sensation flooding his body. A tingling warmth rushed through his veins, a powerful current that felt like liquid sunlight. It wasn't just strength, it was knowledge, memory, a connection to a lineage stretching back through millennia. It was the strength of kings and queens, of warriors and guardians. The dormant power, the bloodline Balagan had tried so hard to extinguish, was awakening within him. The seal in his hand now blazed with a soft, steady light, pulsing in time with his own heartbeat. Slowly, gracefully, Tund rose to his feet. When he opened his eyes, they were no longer the familiar brown of the boy they knew. They were glowing with a soft, ethereal golden light, a light that spoke of immense power and profound sorrow. His voice, when he spoke, was his own, yet deeper, resonant with the echoes of his ancestors. "The blood of my father," he declared, his gaze locking onto the stunned sorcerer, "lives in me." The declaration hit Balagan like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his face a mask of horror and denial. No, his entire life's work, his bloody ascent to power, was built on the belief that he had severed the royal bloodline forever. Yet here stood the proof of his failure, a ghost from the past reborn in the sun. Tund had been a simple village boy, a nobody. Without another word, Tund raised the seal high above his head. The golden light flared, casting long, dancing shadows. The very ground beneath them began to tremble, a low, deep rumble that shook the trees and rattled the bones of every person present. The tremor was centered on Balagan. The usurper's legs gave way, and he crashed to his knees, not in supplication, but forced down by a power he could not comprehend or resist. He looked up at Tund, at the glowing eyes and the face of the king he had murdered, and saw his doom. Tund looked down at the man who had stolen his family, his heritage, and his kingdom. His voice, now filled with the weight of generations of grief and the unyielding strength of a true king, rang out across the silent clearing, a final judgment. "Your reign," he said, the words sealing Balagan's fate, "ends tonight." A new era was about to begin, forged in loss but destined for greatness. The storm finally broke, and when the last gust of wind died down, a strange quiet fell over the square. Balagan was gone, vanished. He hadn't been struck down by a sword or a spell, but by something far more potent, the truth. The air, once thick with tension and the smell of ozone, now felt clean, washed anew. One by one, then all at once, the men of the Brotherhood dropped to one knee. A murmur rippled through their ranks, a sound like the turning of a tide. "The rightful heir," they whispered, their voices a mix of awe and relief. Their gazes were fixed on Tund. He stood there, not as a conqueror, but as a man who had simply survived. He turned to Adora, his eyes wide with a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. "I never wanted this," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted power." Adora looked at him, her expression a gentle mix of pride and understanding. A soft smile touched her lips. "I know," she said, "and that's why you are the one who must lead, because you won't be corrupted by it." Her words seemed to anchor him. He took a deep breath, the first one that didn't feel like a struggle, and turned to face the crowd of kneeling men. He looked out at their faces, illuminated by the flickering torchlight, and saw not just warriors, but fathers, sons, and brothers. Men who had been living in the shadow of fear for far too long. He raised his voice, not in a shout of command, but in a clear, steady promise. "There will be no more fear," he declared. "No more darkness. We will not rebuild what was broken. We will build a new path, together. A path of honor, of light." Slowly, as if awakening from a long dream, the men began to lower their torches, extinguishing the flames one by one. The aggressive orange glow was replaced by the soft, pre-dawn light. They bowed their heads, not in submission to a new master, but in respect for a new beginning. The era of Balagan was over. Adora moved to Tund's side and gently took his hand, her touch a source of incredible strength. "Your father," she said softly. "He would be so proud of the man you've become." A long, weary sigh escaped him. He looked down at their joined hands, then back out at the horizon, where the first hints of color were beginning to bleed into the dark sky. "It's funny," he mused, a small, tired smile on his face. "Just a short time ago, I was the poorest man in all of Lekki, but somehow, I was the richest in everything that truly matters." Adora leaned her head against his shoulder, her presence a comforting warmth against the morning chill. "Love?" she prompted gently. "Family? Destiny?" Tund nodded slowly as the dawn broke fully, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and rose. He finally understood. "All of it," he agreed. "But something more. It doesn't matter where you start or where life takes you. The greatest power you can ever hold is the power to choose what kind of person you become." Together, they stood and watched the new day arrive, a silent promise passing between them, ready to build a future defined not by fate, but by choice. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this.